Detroit, Michigan, August 1975. The air inside Cobo Hall was electric with anticipation, thick with cigarette smoke, and the heat radiating from 12,000 bodies packed shoulder to shoulder. Kiss was at the height of their powers. The makeup, the fire, the blood, the spectacle that had transformed them from four guys from New York into living comic book characters. But on this night, something would happen that had nothing to do with pyrotechnics or platform boots. Something that would force Ace Frehley, the man behind the Silver Space Ace makeup, to choose between silence and speaking up. What happened in those next 5 minutes would ripple through rock history in ways nobody could have predicted, revealing the man beneath the mask in a way no guitar solo ever could. Before we dive deeper into this untold story, if you want to discover the hidden moments that defined rock and roll's most iconic figures, the stories that never made it into the official biographies, please subscribe to our channel. This is a story that's been whispered about in green rooms and tour buses for decades, but never fully told until now. To understand what happened that August night, you need to understand who Ace Frehley really was beneath the cosmic persona. Paul Daniel Frehley grew up in the Bronx, a working-class neighborhood where survival often mattered more than dreams. His father was an electrical worker, his mother a homemaker trying to hold together a family of 6 kids in an apartment that always felt too small. The Bronx in the 1950s and 60s was a melting pot. Puerto Rican families next to Italian families, next to Irish families, next to black families, everyone trying to make it. Everyone struggling with the same problems of poverty and prejudice. Young Paul learned guitar in these streets, learned music from everyone around him, absorbed the sounds of doo-wop groups on street corners, the blues pouring out of basement clubs, the early rock and roll that mixed everything together into something new and dangerous. The guitar became Paul's escape and his identity. While other kids were playing stickball or getting into trouble, he was in his room practicing chords until his fingers bled, learning solos note by note from records he played until the vinyl wore thin. He wasn't the best student, wasn't headed for college or a professional career, but he could make that guitar sing in ways that made people stop and listen, made them forget for a moment about the struggles of daily life in a cramped Bronx apartment. Music was the universal language in his neighborhood, the thing that connected everyone regardless of where their parents had come from or what color their skin was. That lesson, absorbed unconsciously through years of musical immersion, would prove crucial on a stage in Detroit years later. When Ace joined Kiss in late 1972, he became the final piece of a puzzle that Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley had been trying to solve. They had the concept, the theatrical approach, the business ambition. What they needed was a lead guitarist who could deliver the solos and the swagger to match the visual spectacle they were planning. Ace brought both, along with something else, a genuine working-class authenticity that grounded Kiss, even as they were reaching for the cosmos. The Space Ace character was born out of necessity and accident. Gene was the demon, Paul the star child, Peter the cat. Ace needed something that fit his personality. The guy who seemed slightly detached, cool, living in his own universe. The silver makeup and space theme made sense, but what people didn't understand then and still don't fully grasp now is how much Ace used that character as armor, protection against a world that had never been particularly kind to a kid from the Bronx who just wanted to play guitar. The makeup took an hour to apply before each show, a ritualistic transformation that turned Paul Daniel Frehley into Space Ace. Silver base covering every inch of exposed skin, black stars around the eyes, the distinctive pattern that would become one of the most recognizable images in rock history. But the transformation went deeper than cosmetics. When Ace put on that makeup, when he strapped on his Les Paul and walked onto a stage, he became something larger than himself, a character that could do things and say things that shy Paul Frehley from the Bronx might have struggled with. The irony, of course, was that on the night in Detroit when it mattered most, it would be Paul Frehley, not Space Ace, who would find the courage to speak. By 1975, Kiss was exploding. The Alive album, recorded earlier that year at Cobo Hall and other venues, was starting to gain traction, transforming them from a cult act into a genuine phenomenon. They were playing bigger venues, seeing crowds that had grown from hundreds to thousands. The Detroit show in August was part of a summer tour that felt like a victory lap. Confirmation that everything they had worked for, the endless rehearsals, the van tours, the makeup that left their skin raw, was finally paying off. But success brought exposure, and exposure meant performing in front of audiences that weren't always there just for the music. Audiences that brought their prejudices and anger with them into the arena. The concert was going exactly as planned. They had opened with Deuce, ripped through Strutter, Cold Gin, and were building toward the part of the show where Ace took center stage for his smoking guitar solo. This was his moment every night. The sequence where the Space Ace character came fully alive, where Ace's Les Paul seemed to become an extension of his body, where the guitar didn't just make music, but actually smoked from a special effect rigged into the pickups. The Marshall amps behind him were cranked to maximum volume, creating a wall of sound that could be felt as much as heard. The crowd was going wild, exactly the reaction they wanted, exactly what they had worked for. Ace stepped forward, his platform boots steady on the stage, his fingers poised over the strings, ready to deliver the blistering solo that would drive the crowd into a frenzy. Then it happened, during the brief moment of relative quiet before Ace's solo, when the band pulled back to let him step forward. A voice from somewhere in the general admission section, amplified by the temporary silence, cut through everything with words so hateful they seemed to poison the air itself. The slur wasn't directed at Ace. It was aimed at a group of black fans near the front of the stage, young people who had been dancing and cheering louder than anyone else in the venue, fully immersed in the Kiss experience. They had saved their money to buy tickets, had lined up for hours to get good positions near the stage, had come to lose themselves in the music and the spectacle. The words were chosen specifically to hurt, to diminish, to remind these fans that even here, in a space that should have been about nothing but music and joy, they weren't welcome by everyone. The band heard it. The people near the stage heard it. And in that instant, the carefully choreographed spectacle of a Kiss show collided with the ugly reality of American racism in the mid-1970s. Ace Frehley stopped playing. His hands simply froze on the Les Paul, the last note hanging in the air before dying away into uncomfortable silence. Gene and Paul, mid-motion in their stage positions, looked toward Ace, uncertain what was happening. This wasn't part of the script, wasn't one of the planned dramatic pauses. Peter's drumming faltered and stopped. For several seconds, Cobo Hall was filled with a silence that felt heavy and wrong. 12,000 people suddenly aware that something had gone badly off script. Ace, hidden behind the silver Space Ace makeup, stood motionless at center stage, and everyone who was there later said they could feel something building. A tension that had nothing to do with showmanship and everything to do with real, raw emotion. What happened next wasn't calculated. It wasn't a PR strategy or a carefully considered moral stance. It wasn't something Gene Simmons had planned as part of the Kiss marketing genius. It was instinct, something rising up from deep in Ace's Bronx upbringing, from the streets where he had learned that you either stood up for people or you were part of the problem. Ace walked to the edge of the stage, guitar still in his hands, the Les Paul's weight familiar and comforting even in this moment of uncertainty. He looked out into the crowd, and when he spoke, his voice came through the PA system without the usual rock star bravado, without the theatrical affect of the Space Ace character. It was just Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx, talking to a room full of people who needed to hear what he had to say. "Hold on," Ace said, his voice cutting through the confused murmur that had replaced the music. "We need to stop for a minute here." He gestured toward the section where the black fans were standing, where the slur had been directed, where young faces showed a mixture of hurt and resigned familiarity with this kind of hatred. "I just heard something that's not okay. Not in here. Not at our show. Not anywhere." The silence that followed was absolute now. Everyone in Cobo Hall holding their breath, unsure whether this was part of the show or something real breaking through the theater. Somewhere in the lighting booth, a technician kept the spotlight trained on Ace, unsure what else to do. The moment stretched out, every second feeling like an eternity. Ace continued, his words coming slowly but with an intensity that everyone could feel radiating from the stage. Kiss doesn't belong to just one type of person. This music, rock and roll, it comes from everyone. Black musicians, white musicians, Puerto Rican, everyone who ever picked up a guitar or sat at a drum kit and decided to make something that mattered. If you can't understand that, if you can't respect that, then you're at the wrong show. The words landed with weight, each sentence a hammer blow against the hatred that had tried to poison the evening. In the audience, people were looking around, trying to identify who had shouted the slur, trying to process what was happening. Some fans were nodding in agreement, others looked uncomfortable, uncertain how to react to this sudden injection of reality into what was supposed to be escapist entertainment. Gene Simmons, standing stage right in his full demon regalia, later said that moment was one of the most powerful he had ever witnessed. Not because of what Ace said, though that mattered, but because of how completely he meant it. There was no performance in those words, no calculation about how it would play with different segments of their audience. It was simply Ace drawing a line, making it clear what he stood for, even if it cost them fans or created controversy. Paul Stanley, the star child, walked over to stand next to Ace in a visual show of solidarity, his star-spangled eye makeup catching the stage lights. Then Gene joined them, and finally Peter Criss came out from behind his drum riser, all four members of Kiss standing together at the front of the stage, a united front making it clear that what Ace had said spoke for all of them. "Now," Ace said, his voice stronger now, the initial uncertainty replaced by conviction. "I'm going to play this solo for everyone who came here to have a good time, for everyone who loves this music, and especially for those fans right there. Because they're the reason we do this. Not for hate, not for division, for the music." He raised his Les Paul, positioned his fingers on the fretboard, and looked back at his bandmates. Gene nodded. Paul raised his guitar, Peter lifted his drumsticks, and then Ace launched into what would become the most blistering guitar solo of his career up to that point. He poured everything into it, all the anger at what he had heard, all the passion he felt for music as a universal language, all the working-class frustration with a world that still divided people by skin color in 1975, more than a decade after the Civil Rights Act. The Les Paul sang and screamed in his hands, the pickups smoking as planned, but the notes themselves carrying an emotional weight that transcended the usual showmanship. His fingers flew across the fretboard, bending strings until they nearly broke, hitting harmonics that rang out like bells across the arena, creating a sonic tapestry that was part rage, part celebration, part defiance. The crowd responded with an ovation that shook the building, drowning out whatever negativity had tried to poison the evening. 12,000 voices raised in approval and support. What Ace Frehley did that night in Detroit wasn't headline news outside the rock world. There were no newspaper articles the next day, no think pieces about race relations in rock music, no television interviews about the incident. But within the Kiss community, among the fans and the band's growing following, word spread quickly. This was before the internet, before social media, but stories traveled through letters to fan clubs, through conversations in record stores, through the organic network that connected music fans in the 1970s. Some fans were angry, felt that Ace had stepped out of line, that rock concerts should be escapes from social issues rather than platforms for moral stands. There were letters to the Kiss fan club accusing Ace of being political, of ruining the fantasy by injecting reality into the show, of forgetting that people paid good money to be entertained, not lectured. Some radio stations in certain markets quietly reduced their Kiss rotation, and a few scheduled concert dates in southern markets became complicated as venues expressed concerns about potential controversy. But there were other consequences too, ones that mattered more in the long run and revealed something important about who Kiss's real audience was. Black fans, who had always been part of the Kiss army, but sometimes felt like their presence was invisible in the narrative of who Kiss's audience was, felt seen and valued in a new way. They organized more visibly at Kiss concerts, created their own sections within fan clubs, wore their Kiss makeup with pride, and became some of the band's most loyal supporters. Musicians of color, particularly in the emerging heavy metal and hard rock scenes, noticed what had happened and credited it as a moment that helped them feel welcome in genres that were often portrayed as exclusively white spaces. Within the band itself, the incident strengthened something that had already been there, but perhaps not fully articulated. A sense that they weren't just entertainers, but also people with platforms and responsibilities. The Detroit incident revealed something essential about Ace Frehley that the Space Ace character sometimes obscured. Behind the silver, makeup, and cosmic persona was someone deeply shaped by growing up in a diverse neighborhood, someone who had learned guitar alongside people from every background, someone who understood at a fundamental level that music transcended the artificial boundaries society tried to impose. Ace had never been the most articulate member of Kiss in interviews, had never been comfortable with the press or with talking about serious issues. He was the quiet one, the guy who let Gene and Paul handle the business and the speeches, who preferred to let his guitar do the talking. But when it mattered, when silence would have been complicity, when staying quiet would have meant allowing hatred to go unchallenged, he found his voice. Over the years that followed, Ace's willingness to speak up in Detroit would be echoed in other moments, some public, some private. When Kiss played venues with discriminatory policies about where different fans could sit, Ace made his objections known to management, sometimes threatening not to perform unless the policies were changed. When recording sessions or business meetings included casual racism, the kind that people in the 1970s often dismissed as jokes or harmless banter, Ace didn't laugh along, didn't participate, made his discomfort clear through silence or direct confrontation. He was never preachy about it. never positioned himself as a civil rights crusader or tried to claim credit for being progressive. But he also never let ugliness pass unchallenged when he witnessed it. Never allowed his platform to be used in ways that contradicted his basic sense of fairness and dignity. In later years, when asked about the Detroit incident in interviews, Ace Frehley has typically been modest, almost dismissive. "I just said what needed to be said," he explained in one interview from the 1990s. "It wasn't a big deal. Somebody said something ugly, and I responded. That's what you do." This characteristic understatement reflects Ace's general discomfort with being portrayed as any kind of moral exemplar. He sees himself as a guitar player, a rock and roller, someone who happened to be in a position to speak up and did so, but not as a social activist or political figure. Yet this very humility makes the act more powerful in some ways. Ace didn't stop the show in Detroit to position himself as a hero or to generate publicity, or to advance any agenda beyond the simple principle that people deserve to be treated with respect. The other members of KISS have spoken about Detroit as well, usually in the context of discussing what made the band's bond strong during those early years. Gene Simmons, in his typically grandiose style, has called it a defining moment that proved KISS stood for something beyond just spectacle and marketing. Paul Stanley has described feeling proud to stand with Ace in that moment, proud that their band was willing to take a position even when it might have been professionally costly. Peter Criss, in his more emotional way, has said that Detroit showed him the best of what KISS could be, musicians using their platform to push back against ugliness and stand up for what was right. 50 years later, the story of what happened at Cobo Hall in August 1975 remains relevant, a reminder that artists have platforms that extend beyond entertainment, that they have the power to influence culture in ways that transcend their art, and that how they use that power matters. For the Black fans who were targeted that night, those who were there later described the experience as transformative. They had come to the concert as music fans, hoping to enjoy themselves, and instead found themselves reminded cruelly of the racism that shadowed their daily lives. But Ace's response, the band's visible solidarity, turned a moment of hurt into something else. Confirmation that they belonged, that their presence mattered, that rock and roll was theirs too. On August 15, 1975, at Cobo Hall in Detroit, Ace Frehley had to choose between staying silent and speaking up, between keeping the show going and addressing something that needed to be addressed, between being just an entertainer and being a human being with principles. He chose to speak up, to stop the show, to draw a line against hatred even when it was uncomfortable and risky. He didn't end racism that night. He didn't change the world. But he made clear to 12,000 people what he stood for and what his band stood for. He showed that rock and roll, at its best, belongs to everyone, that it can be a force for bringing people together rather than dividing them. The guitar solo that followed was blistering and memorable, the kind of moment that made Ace Frehley a legend. But the words he spoke before that solo, the stand he took, that's what made him more than just a legend. That's what made him someone worth remembering, not just for the music he created, but for the courage he showed when it mattered most.